on today's episode of The Mythic Masculine.
At 40 years, something can become a tradition after 40 years. If there's 3 generations involved, if there's a few rules, but like you survived the 40 years in the wilderness, so to speak. So there's a question, could it cross over now into the culture in a way where it can carry the right kind of soil, the right kind of seed, and actually take root in a healthy way, where instead of inventing manhoods and so on, it's really welcoming men home to earth, to belonging, to not feeling like the third wheel gender or the outsized, overbearing other thing that doesn't seem to know how to fit.
What does it mean to be a man? And what kind of masculinity is needed to meet these uncertain times? In an era defined by polarized conflict and existential threat, how can we draw upon the rich lineage of mythopoetics to navigate this terrain? I'm your host, Ian McKenzie, and together with an array of guests, we'll explore various pathways to realign masculinity with thriving life. Greetings, dear listener. My guest today is Jonathan Stensland, a poet and longtime collaborator and friend of Robert Bly. This conversation was recorded in 2024 at the 40th anniversary of the Minnesota Men's Conference. Speaking from the banks of the St. Croix River, Jonathan offers a unique insider's perspective on 4 decades of men's work. In his early 20s, Jonathan was involved with Bly as he worked on this seminal book, Iron John, through typing up handwritten pages, revisions, and countless conversations, a process Stensland describes as practically like quilt making. His relationship was deeper than professional collaboration, as akin to a godson to Bly and his wife Ruth. In our conversation today, we explore the origins and evolution of the mythopoetic men's movement, from its roots in Robert Bly's poetry about fathers and grief, and we delve into the power of men gathering around the goodness that exists in the marrow of masculinity. He speaks to the movement's influence on broader culture and the morphogenetic field that made new ways of being available to men everywhere. We ask, what does it mean for a 40-year tradition to cross from the wilderness into culture? How can we broaden the spaces where men can do the necessary soul work of maturation? And what mythic stories might guide the next chapter of this work? Before we begin, you're invited to check out my website, The Mythic Masculine, to explore upcoming in-person and online offerings, as well as how to become a paid Substack supporter. This podcast is a true labor of love, and I've never accepted advertising. Instead, I rely on listeners like you to fund the show. If you have found insight and solace from my conversations, please consider upgrading your membership. Visit themythicmasculine.com for more details. And now, enjoy my conversation with Jonathan Stensland. Welcome, Jonathan, to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Could you describe where you are in this moment, physically, geographically, and also how you're feeling? What's present for you?
I am on the St. Croix River, the Wisconsin side of the Minnesota-Wisconsin border, overlooking a ravine that cuts down into the St. Croix River itself, surrounded by ash trees that are actually doing well, even though ash borer is a thing around here these days. Some oaks, white pine, and breezes visiting all of it. It's really nice, sweet spot. And I'm feeling that exact thing, just kind of part of the breath of the day.
And could you tell us where we are in terms of what particular event we're at, and where are we in the event?
Mm-hmm. We're in the finale now of the Minnesota Men's Conference 40th anniversary. We've focused this week on Iron John story and some Haida, some Navajo, and some, I think, Lakota stories. And the conversation around those is considered a way of kind of feeding the stories themselves, substantiating them, letting them get up and walk around again among human beings and human lives, which really is the flavor of the work these days. So you've joined us in that era when that's what's really being done.
Can you describe, what is this to you, 40th anniversary of this event? What does it mean to you? And also, what does it mean to the organizers and the people who care about this event?
It struck me marvelously. I go back to visit that image of you and I over at Lakewood Cemetery and the stone. Something about that seemed to be where we shifted into the week from just receiving, from receiving a guest to beginning an adventure, I think. So that is almost a perfect image, isn't it, for this moment in time after 40 years, ending at a headstone of husband and wife who's still alive and held dear. This time now, some could argue it's time to open things up to all kinds of new considerations and new lateral movements that are interfacing and traveling across the waters of this men's work that we've been doing all this time, which has gone through several phases or chapters of the heart, like every 13 years or so, like a human being, it's altered itself in some fundamental ways, really. But there was, at 40 years, there's a tradition that something can become a tradition after 40 years if it learns how to do that. If there's 3 generations involved, if there's a few rules, but like you survive the 40 years in the wilderness, so to speak. So there's a question. Is what we've done the last 40 years sort of been done in the wilderness? Could it cross over now into the culture in a way where it can carry the right kind of soil, the right kind of seed, and actually take root in a healthy way without too much grandiosity driving it, too much ambition and too much desire for a certain kind of exercise, but really a way of being that welcomes, where instead of inventing manhoods and so on, it's really welcoming men home, to earth, to belonging, to not feeling like the third wheel gender or the outsized, overbearing other thing that doesn't seem to know how to fit, but that actually has a lot to contribute. It might be able to say the right word at the right time, to the right ear, where it can be food in the right moment, or a hand supporting somebody in the right way at the right time, not falsely offer a bridge that doesn't exist or something else, but really just that amount that's necessary. So it becoming just kind of the necessary amount of men's work to have in their lives, to have as companionship, conception, comprehensions, some divine comprehensions, but ways that help celebrate the fact that we are alive and have a desire to live and to live the right way. The right way being, I suppose, the way where in living other things are either brought to life, want to live, or can live along parallel just fine. I would put it like that.
What is specific about this container with men that has been unique and has felt important? Like, for example, that's not out there in the culture at large, but in particular amongst men doing this work.
An interesting thing about that on my mind was there was a book of poetry released by Robert Bly, coterminous really with the beginning of this, which is lost oftentimes in the cultural memory of how things occurred. And it was a book of poems called The Man in the Black Coat Turns. And these were father poems and grief poems. Robert was at that point I suppose they came out about 1985, 86. And the first conference was 84, 85. So these poems were being written in the early 80s, right up to that point. And what's usually thought of as the onset of this particular event is the article with Michael Ventura. What is it? What was the name of that article again? Do you remember that one? What do men really want, but there was this question about men and the culture, and Michael Ventura and Robert had done that. It was a New Age journal, and it got picked up, and it was really, it was the public thruster, but the private one really was that book of poems, The Man in the Black Coat Turns, father poems and son poems. So back to the question as you were asking at the beginning, could you just remind me, because I know the takeoff, but I'm not sure.
What do you find is valuable? I'm going to ask you about Bly too in a second,
Yeah.
but I think that what do you find is valuable about men gathering in this way?
Well, in that book of poems, there was this image, 50 men sitting together in hall or crowded room, lifting something indistinct up into the resonating night. And that was it. See, that image was really I think that's what people moved toward. And so there was something that we began to understand early on as just cellular, being together with other men in the timbres and tones of voice and so forth, and even the kind of alarms and urgencies or whatever might be there when a cluster of men gather together. What are they doing? Going off to war? Why would they be doing that? In the first place, there was an excitement, an oscillation. And with that oscillation, there was a certain kind of awakeness, just being awake to the moment. Like when you're out in a deer stand and you have this intention, we're going to harvest meat now. Every little twig snap, every little thing is a signal. So our being together at that time, that was a signal too. We weren't hunting or harvesting meat or doing that, but we were harvesting hearts somehow with an intention for that, and a lot of faith. Maybe even tremendous doubts, but really a tremendous amount of faith. And I have a feeling that, in part, is sort of the secret ingredient, is just how much faith there is deep down in men, despite the record of humanity, that there's something good in the marrow of a man that, if drawn out right and drawn out well, could really help bring color and depth and range to the world that we live in, that we offer to our children. So... I think we're touching on it. We're orbiting it at least there.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. I'm struck by, I think a lot of men carry a sense of, like the ones that are willing to be touched by the sense of carnage and mayhem and violence, right, that is wrought by men. This is certainly my case. When I was younger, I'd look out and say, what is wrong with men?
Yeah.
Right? They seem like they're just awful, tearing apart the world, destructive. And I lived with that for a long time, right? A sense of, I don't want to be like other men, or basically all other men, right? And so I would live my life somewhat as a reaction to a sense of inner and outer disgust in a way, right?
Could you put some age to that?
Probably, 13, 14 even.
Oh, that early.
Yeah. Right. A sense of just sensing like, wow, that men are awful, right? And not really having a deep trust in men. I had young men on my soccer team and things like that. I had some close friends, but overall it was like, the track record didn't seem good for men.
Mm-hmm. Bunch of stupid bastards.
Yeah, wrecking the world, basically.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's something really tragic in a way and sorrowful about a sense of nothing to aspire to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other than simply, I would call it being less worse than the worst men.
Wow.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of white knighting in that, of course, right?
Sure.
A sense of, maybe I could be one that'll, be the good guy, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot of men fall into that. But it's a reactionary place because it also disowns the part of masculinity that is within you by saying, not that, men are terrible, as this unconscious belief. And it wasn't until I started getting into this work, and I think maybe this is part of the DNA that it does draw men to this, but that there is something, like you just named, a kind of a noble quality of what can deep masculinity offer and what can men offer that is actually truly necessary and part of this tapestry of humanness. And without the right places to draw that out, right, and places like, as I see, like this, and a cultural way, that it's not a given, right, that it happens. And a lot of men suffer in silence and suicide and isolation and the rest, because it's not, the culture itself doesn't draw that from men. And in fact, it tends to draw the worst from men.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't, and you'll notice too, I think, though, that there are some background sounds from whatever the work was that carried over and actually began to move into the culture and substantiate things. Sort of like you would begin to see men hugging, even if they'd not been to a men's conference. Fathers hugging sons, things that just did not happen prior to the 80s. Yeah. And so some of what we were doing, I have a feeling, was psychically contagious, beyond, however, the way that a virus spreads. More like the way a heavy metal poisoning spreads, through the atmosphere, through the air. Something was definitely being blown off of us because of the way the attention, media attentions, and creative workers, like writers for TV shows and sitcoms, things like that, the way that they were kind of blasting off this little rock of what we are formed this kind of cultural comet's tail that lit up the sky in a certain kind of way, where you can talk to somebody who's never even read Iron John, but they'll have like their hairy man story. So there was a way in which what we were doing generated some kind of a cultural contamination that actually opened up an envelope that had been closed and kind of unfolded, and you realize, oh, this was an aerogram from kind of like the roots of manhood towards a longing that to fill an absence that men did and were able to identify prior.
There's a great term, actually. The work of Rupert Sheldrake is helpful here, but he uses the term morphogenetic field, which just made me think of what you were saying, actually, like that it offered some shift in the morphogenetic field that is non-local in a sense that it becomes available anywhere.
Yeah.
Right. And that
you're right. That is a good term for that. Let's just go with that word for a moment too, like morphogenetic.
Yeah. Morphogenetic field.
So that some suggestion that it actually got into the methylations or something of actually the DNA in a way, like the DNA's clothing shifted a little bit, like its fashion statement, like how the DNA was going to present manhood shifted.
And it's even interesting too, because I understand, right? The early days, a lot of this was mocked, right? A lot of
it was mocked,
like men, we don't want soft men or whatever, all this stuff, and how at the same time it still seems to work its way into. Even under the mocking, there's a sense of possibility.
I agree.
Men can be this way with each other.
Because apparently there is a ground intuition that maybe it has to do with the anthropos, with this notion of that. Let's just say this, like that there's a man who's composed of every man alive. He's not one guy. He's not Richard Nixon. And, he's not even Robert Bly, and he's not Ronald Reagan or whatever like this. But for that man to get up on Earth and move around, wake up, every hour around the planet and then go back to sleep and so on, that man had a destiny. That man had as much cringe going on in him as any individual young man at the time that was feeling contemptuous or disgust or desire to disown or to just go straight to heaven and let's just bypass having lived a life, because going from boy to God would be a really nice trip. I guess one of the things that came along the way, and this is due to Robert, though, is that there was a porosity with him, I think, open to the information in the anthropos, if you would, at this time. What was the deep desire for the male archetype from manifesting and expressing itself on Earth now? And I would just go with something there. I would hate to just hog the whole thing, but there was an image emerging there, which was, if you follow that idea of there's this male that is on Earth that's composed of all the human males. And it maybe relates to all the other males of other species in some kind of way too, in terms of how it is considering its design, its style of praise, its admiration. Well, one of the great contributors, I have a sense, was ways in which failure would have been understood, for instance, like a consciousness of failure. This was an inheritance through a Venezuelan Jungian or a Cuban Jungian who ended up in Venezuela. That's how that one would have gone. Rafael Lopez Pedraza wrote a book with 4 essays that I think were pretty influential. And one of them is entitled Moon Madness. The other one is something to do with a duende, an earth spirit, a chthonic, energetic, as if blood that's gone into the earth comes back out as a kind of genius to guide the living and teach them all kinds of things. And another one was the consciousness of failure. He asserts that the real brink of difference between going into a psychosis and not is if a person has a consciousness of failure, meaning they can fail and they can fail consciously, and they don't feel like they've been exterminated by failure, they're probably not going to have a psychotic break. They'll probably just break down into something that can learn from what it's going through. So you kind of get that sense of a genius behind all of this that's really open to genius and so on.
It's interesting hearing those threads too. What sparked in me actually was the movie Fight Club. Right? And have you seen it, I assume?
I've seen those scenes.
Okay.
And I'm not 100% sure I've seen it. I lived forever without a TV.
Okay.
I'd go to movies, but if I didn't catch it in the theater, I didn't see it. But
I could sketch it for you because it is a really fascinating.
I just know nobody talks about that.
Yeah, it's very the motif is very interesting, right? Because it's basically the main character, Edward Norton. He's this domesticated man, right?
Yeah.
Just kind of living his life numb, going along in this consumerist track, deeply dissatisfied. And he ends up meeting this kind of wild twin, in a way, through Brad Pitt's character, Tyler Durden. And I kind of spoil the end if you haven't seen it. But basically, though, there's this tension between them. Yeah, the tension between them is Tyler's this wild twin is constantly kind of bringing him into edgier and edgier territory of like, wake up, be alive, like rebel from the status quo, right, of the domesticated man.
Yeah.
And at the same time, what ends up happening is he draws him into somewhat of a fascist militancy against the system.
Oh,
which is one way to react against domestication.
Yeah.
Right. And I say this because I think that the power of what Bly sparked was really a longing at the heart of domestic man to feel more vital and alive and connected to life in ways, that the overculture was cutting us off from.
Yeah.
So that's to me where the primordial wild man actually sparked such deep imagination and possibility. And then the other piece, of course, is the father hunger that it has attracted many men around him, right? A sense of here is a man, maybe an undomesticated man in a way, living in such a way. I hear stories of, he's kind of Zorba the Greek or whatever, like this kind of just himself being this tornado of life and vitality that drew a lot of men who, again, didn't have fathers like that, right? To this particular generation that, he was just ahead of. So to me, there's like those two vectors seem so alive in the DNA of this, right? The father hunger and the wild man. I wonder what you might say. As one also who discovered Bly and met him, I understand, quite early on.
I'm one of those that really does love to hold on to the word wild. There's been a lot of questioning of that from the standpoint of, if you treat the wilderness like it's wild, then it falls into a certain kind of othered category and things. But what I love about the wild is the spontaneous. And that's what Robert loved about that word. And, but content-rich spontaneity, just the appearance of something making its appearance, like an epiphany, like the appearance of the deity suddenly is in the room. And the way that can shine off things is the way that awakens neurons that love that and otherwise just snooze. And so this ability to recognize what might help feather the bird, bring this thing in from that way, bring that in from that direction. And in a way that was being generous with the giver of the gift, first of all. And so not just like fleecing somebody who brought content. That person, somebody who would come in like Melodoma, came into us and then becomes really substantiated in that community for years and years and years and years, as long as he wants to, until their life diverges in some other way. Or with Martine Brechtel, who was tremendously generous with this community. And so there was this way in which this particular community, like the nation itself, was turning towards things as they were emerging. And I've heard you in the talk about the emergent. And there was a way in which this particular conference was tuning into the universe in very well in advance. Before Melodoma came, I was visiting with Robert and Ruth saying, something's coming out of Africa. I don't know if it's in 3 months or 6 months. Boom, there's Melodoma. We were deep dreamers in the true sense of the word dream, like dreaming, and through that anticipating and growing the spiritual organs to metabolize the next thing that was going to be happening. So we were good receivers of the gifts that came, and those gifts aggregated and were built on and are retained to this day and have developed a kind of manner and a way of going about things that I don't think is easily duplicated, but I don't know anymore. It might be like you were talking about the morphogenetic fields. It might be possible that somebody gives it a genuine attempt, could really come back up with it again.
Well, it strikes me as well that this time, in particular, the 40th anniversary, is happening in the wake of a kind of, I'm calling it a bit of a heyday, right? Like I saw the brochures up there that somebody had brought from those early, like I think 2001 or 2002, and like the roster there, it's almost, I call them almost the all-star hockey team or something. Right?
That's a good way to put that.
Bly and Martine and Melodoma and Michael Mead, and
John Lee, Rob Moore, blah blah blah.
It's quite a roster there, and I'm sitting here going like, oh man, I can't imagine what that would have been like. And now, of course, Bly passed a few years ago, and of course hasn't been at the conference, I understand, for a while before that. But there's a sense that these like towering figures that were present. And
James Hillman, for instance,
exactly,
just like a monster in his field of.
Yeah. And so now it seems like an interesting time to be in the wake of that, right? And what is this moment for the conference itself and the organizers?
You know what? I would describe now as not the wake of that. The wake of it was prior to Robert's finally passing away, and the year 10 months or so before burying. The memorial and burying. Now it feels like we are standing on new ground, new old ground, afresh, and all that has happened, and all that had been generated. And we're considering maybe doing a litany of the ideas that this men's conference has carried in the last 40 years, because it's tremendous. And I don't think it's out there in the broader men's industry environment, or I don't know what to really call that exactly right now. But there were so many intelligent notions, like the difference between a received idea and a generated idea, something that you generate or are receiving. How much is your wherewithal, how much does that consist of received ideas, purely received ideas? And how much have you actually generated an idea to handle something that you worked out the essential angles on as important, as significant somehow, and then started to bring language to thought, idea, generate. We really wanted as much as possible of the generated ideas. But we've just had such a great trove of that. And at some point we will do that. We're going to come up with an anthology and we'll release it, so that we're not going to try to keep all those canaries. We'll get them out there.
And so maybe just to jump back to your own personal encounter with Bly, which happened quite early on.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear a little bit of that story, because you were involved with the Iron John book, which has been credited with sparking a lot of this. But I'd just love to hear a bit of that personal aspect from you.
Yeah, let's go back from that. I was it was a little bit more than a typist role. Robert would meet me with the pages that he had handwritten. And then I would take those pages.
And this is like mid-80s?
Late 80s.
Late 80s, okay.
Then I would type those up and then bring them back. There'd be about 10 pages. And then he would meet me with the ones I had just given him the last time we met. And he'll have cut out a paragraph that he liked, and then handwritten, tape that to a page, and then handwritten above and below and around. And pages might have several of those taped on things. So it was really, truly cut and paste kind of scenario, but with tape. And then I would type those up, but we would talk about all of those things. And then I would write him messages in the sidelines about the stuff that we were working on. So it was a fully engaged kind of thing. It was very cool. And I'd say I was about 23. Well, that would be about 10 years or 11 years after I first dreamt of Robert and Ruth, before I knew them. And so the relationship in a way goes back all the way to a dream after mowing more than enough lawns on a hot July day. And I went in to take a nap at 1:30 because I was fried. And then it was like a raven flew between my pillow and the sun. And it was that dream crossing my mind. And so there was something always familial and intact. And I learned from Robert that a lot of people had that happen to them when he and Ruth had connected, made their connection. And so there was something there. And there would have been tens of different ways in which Robert and I would have, it seems, have collided, both coming out of that Norwegian Lutheran Minnesota background in part, both families having places on the same lake, my relatives having built things for his. There's just on. And it happened.
And what was he to you? I mean, I understand too, the relationship may have shifted over time because you met him quite young. Was he like a grandfather?
He was my godfather.
Mentor? He was
really a godfather.
Yeah.
He and Ruth are like my godparents in a very real way. In a way that really includes God. Robert and Ruth made the love intelligence, the music of the heart, Robert's wife. And I think it says a lot about him, who his real choice was for a soulmate, is somebody who has intelligent music in her heart, and who can put it into words. And even to this day, standing up in front of a room full of people, she'll put together just a few little things to say that have this compelling sense of living spiritual witness to where we are at this point in time, without any of the extra grand effects, not a guru, not somebody with followers, nothing like that. But witty too, sharp. And Robert, in that way, was just like, it was immediate somehow with he and I, like out of the marrow, just compadres. That's the word he used. So.
And what was it like working on the book that obviously had a cultural impact and continues to?
Yeah.
And how do you feel in terms of your contributions to it?
I feel, well, excellent. The feeling is of excellence, of being involved in something that was of excellence that we knew you had to, you just knew working on that it was going to, because of the point in time we were at in the late 80s and still in the Reagan administration that still hadn't passed. You just knew, well, no, it had actually, by that point, we were in the first Bush years. Yeah. But it was just incredibly timely and so close to the core that you just knew any man who reads this will be moved by it. They really will. Whether they're in a position to move with it, to move with that feeling, they'll be moved having read it. So.
Oh, nice.
Blue Jay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you feel is true still about that book or that story, right? Because I'm struck by like this whole conference as well. We went over Iron John actually is the first story they reintroduced, and I understand the last time was the 25th anniversary with Daniel Deardorff and Martin Shaw. And there's something significant that they thought as well, the organizers this time, to return again to this story, which seems to be like one of the primary conjurers of this whole conference, right? And for me, it's powerful in the sense to revisit a story that has been so vital in this event, and also marking the possibility, is there a time to release that story, right, as the one that is the central axis?
Oh, and build around a different story, you're wondering?
And what might that story be?
Oh, well, that would be I already know what that story would be for me. However, I would never throw away this one.
Throw away maybe isn't quite the right word, right? But more like let rest for a time or something, you know what I mean?
I think
back in the soil,
Oftentimes we do let it rest. So it has obtained that, but I would like to speak, I think, maybe to some of its important ongoing aspects. Like that book, take the area around bucket work, for instance. Bucketing out Iron John out of that pool that he's down in. What guys have come to understand is bucket work through Robert and the grief work. Men's willingness to do time with grief and really working, like not just having the grief attack them like they're the drain at the bottom of the swimming pool through which all the water has to escape. And then, boy, once it escapes, now you're done. You don't have to be that drain anymore. But this way of actually being able to go down underwater with your eyes open and walk around and know the world through it. And understand that grief might be God. Grief might be a teacher. This whole planet in itself might be a grief-pressured learning system. Everything out here is pressured by water, this water piston that rises up in the spring and drops back down in the fall. Or in Minnesota here where we are, this is basically the house of water for the United States. It's not so for Canada because you have many of these places, but this is where it's as if water had gotten pregnant way out in the cosmos and had been looking for a planet, a nest, and was just flopping these long black wings, just weeping for home. A place where she could give birth to life, and then rained herself down here. One teardrop at a time, one feather at a time, and descended into this nesting place here. And we're in the time now where it's like water's going to be flying. All the geese come over us, sweep, sweep, sweep. And as they do it, this place dehydrates, as if they're the horses pulling this chariot that carries water to the south. This like queen of life here. And then in the spring, those same birds return the chariot, and that water returns, and the whole thing comes alive again, starts making its sounds all over again. In winter, it gets to be pretty quiet, except for coyotes and a few crows and things that like to hang around. So, that's the big story that goes on here, and what Robert tapped into. and the magic of it. You tapped into it's in the poetry, it's in the relationship with the lakes and with everything else. I hardly know what I'm saying at this moment in terms of what we were doing with the interview, but it's a really big, important part about what this place is and possibly even why it happened here. Because in a sense, it's as if this is where something frozen unthawed herself to reimagine men, a desirable kind of man. There was a confidence in that. There was a feeling about that might be true.
As beautifully said. I mean, there's something, significant that how the land informs the myth, right? And the fact that, I mean, Bly gathered it from Grimm's, in Bavaria or where it was, in the soils and the folktales of what became Germany. And yet there's something about the soil here, right, that maybe whispered over his shoulder and said, hey, I want to come alive again here. Yeah,
an important thing to know is this is iron earth too. Like you saw that trench out there that the kids are working on, that's red. I was a little surprised to see an ore deposit this far south, but on this side of the river, I suppose that's a possibility. But ironwood, that part of Wisconsin's way up north from here, and same in Minnesota. But this is a place where iron itself is loaded into the planet. This is its spot, its spiritual zip code.
Wow. So, I mean, for the listener as well, there's an episode with storyteller Stephanie Mackay.
That was so good.
Yeah, where she names, I ended up calling the episode an animist retelling of Iron John because she unpacked the story, not from Bly's version. She actually says she never read Bly's version, but through Martine Prechtel's influence, she'd been a student for a long time, but she applied an animist lens on the story and spoke to convincingly that it was a deep story of relationship to iron itself, the element. Not the psychological version, not to dissuade away from the psychological, that has value, but this deeper, older layer was.
I thought she did a spectacular thing with that. And it's not something that would be anathema at all to the people that are here. In fact, I feel oftentimes that the one missing dimension we have oftentimes with our stories and storytelling is not knowing what the original romance might have been behind that story between elements of the planet. Because the love of a romantic story doesn't have to be confined to the human scope whatsoever. It can be between that pollen and that blossom, that nectar and that hummingbird. That is the way to really enrich our presence on this planet, is by learning its love stories. And it's loaded up with them. And I think the backbones of most of these stories were delvings and remembrances. Human beings are one of the few animals that stays awake all winter. And I think it was one of our jobs was to tell the stories of the stories that were on hold during hibernation and make them curious again, to want to come back out from under roots and holes and stones and things and come back out and live again when spring would come, to renew that, because that electricity, that static electricity that starts to wake up and stir in seeds, gets mice breeding like crazy in February inside houses. If you had 2 at the beginning of winter, you probably have 100 by the end of it. There's this activity as if the moon is writing invitations to life at that starting about that time around Candlemas, and starting, I am throwing a tremendous banquet in May. Be there.
I love that.
So that's our brand of this whole stuff. I think was just so open to moving in that direction. So I would say if there was a story to follow, I would actually I would lobby for it to be the story brought from Guatemala by Martine Prechtel, which is The Disobedience of the Daughter of the Sun. It's a gorgeous, profound telling of kind of the waking up of a life to the fact that it's alive. Because life, you could say, spends an enormous amount of time just mapping and masking for the present just to make it go well. Never having thought for a moment that its life was a thing, that its life might wake up to the fact that it's alive. And that's like an emergency, but with a good kind, but still sirens go off and everything else. And it's a good story to have out there for midlife, for this kind of time when whatever it was that was hatching in adolescence and late adolescence and early manhood and things like that, in the very hatching, that strike of cracking down on the egg was lightning refertilizing the next egg that can hatch at midlife. And that I think it's important for men, and women too, to understand. And I think they do, intuitively at least. And sometimes you prepare, but then the plan goes awry nonetheless, but that there is something that's going to emerge around 42, 45 or something like that. And to know that that's out there and to prepare for that so that you can then make your next steps of then after that, thinking about what might be your odd, strangely you way of making a cultural contribution from your life to life itself, your toast to the grand enterprise.
It strikes me then that this conference is 40,
yeah,
right, which is kind of entering
it's approaching that. Yeah.
And at midlife, what do you see is, how does that look to you now in terms of what may be the next phase?
Well, so I'm past it. I'm well past it. I'll be 59, but 45 was amazing. And I thought this was the best kept secret on earth. And that everybody knows who's over 45, they've just done such a great job of keeping it a secret. But for me, it was a remarkable time of awakening, already kind of have been very well awakened kind of to the kind of magic, animal magic, and the magic in the blood and so on, the magic of the heart. Already really being awakened that way, but then being made so tiny, like the little needle in a record player, to be able to then zoom around throughout my dreams and throughout what was occurring in any given day. It was this like a special gift time, kind of like when Jung did the Red Book, where the visionary said, what did the planet have to say, became just filling me, day and night. And I had worked myself so hard, I was just like curled up. I could barely walk prior to this happening. It's like it gets you into the position where it's like life moves you into the X to break through the floor, trap door on the floor, and then boom, you drop through there. And then really the first part of life is just moving around well enough that somehow life can get you later, catch you, stick you down there, and plug you in. And so I really feel like there is something for people to just look forward to, but it will pulverize the crap out of you. But it's the best beating you could ever take.
And what do you see in terms of the conference's own spirit, right? What do you see as a phase shift?
Well, you might have heard some of that a little bit today with Miguel, when after the what would be kind of like the standard polemic move around the room around an idea, whether current kind of idea, dialectic, something that's being struggled with, or rooms, maybe mental rooms being made for, and so on. And that kind of stuff is necessary, and it can actually be kind of exquisite, I find.
Like, for example, like debating patriarchy or gender.
Yeah,
things like that.
And sometimes that stuff, you're with something for 40 years, you've heard the words maybe a little bit too much, not done responsibly. Like, I'm one for always recraft your language, so that you create a basket for the facts that you really want to talk about right now. Do what you can to make that really just authentically captured for just this moment, so that you can really show something there, something that might have some entrails and some gut that leads back, right to you and to the next person, to the situation. Like maybe 10 years ago, it would have been a good time to have talked about young men who fall in love and want to have a child with somebody and are generous and willing to do that, and maybe you get a marriage license, but let the day go by and they don't actually get married. But if you were good enough to be the one that woman dreamt with, well, you're also probably good enough to really get a court-ordered parentage kind of thing, even if you're not going to be the parent, even before a child comes along. Like it might have been wise. There might be some wisdom things that we could start to institute and encourage that don't mean to demean or take away anything from women, but to say, okay, we're in these ventures together in these new ways. The laws are standing where they have stood. And we have these alliances with one another and these deep desires and this way of really having each other's thing. But there are going to be tremendous shifts when a child comes into the world, and we don't know if this coupling is going to be able to really withstand the sheer forces of what that might make, where there's a certain kind of dropping out of some desire, where the woman just wants some guy who's really level and in the suburbs. Suddenly, it wasn't the person she wanted to have fertilize that egg, but it might be who she wants to have keep the child alive, and yet there's this excellence in the men, and it's hard on men when you have children to not be with them, because you're like a cherry tree that's engorged with cherries, and those children are the birds that harvest you to keep your branches light. and you just get heavy with so much material. Good content if you're awake and alive. If your body really responds, your DNA responds to being appointed as a father.
And so do you see that as, like you said, 10 years ago, that might have been useful to talk about as more like
I think it continues. I think it could continue on now, but things shift a little bit more. I think it still could be. Don't get me wrong, because that's why I'm saying it.
But I mean, there's certain issues that you feel maybe are sort of over masticated in a way that the conference has seen over and over again, or
no? I'm suggesting that there might be ways to be in service as mature men.
Okay, to the younger men, for example.
To the younger men.
Okay,
coming along.
Like but practical in some ways.
Yeah, practical, okay. And that we might need to, but for lack of forum. I think forum might be the right word. A forum for that kind of a discussion to encourage something where it doesn't have to come from an animus against this, that, or the other thing, or some people's horror stories, or how this, because there are these ways in which justice is really impersonal. It doesn't care who you are. It cares about the cargo and who you are, maybe as a cargo carrier or as cargo. The society has a certain kind of interest in your well-being, and definitely has an interest in the child's well-being, but how it determines how these responsibilities are going to fall legally and stuff like that is informed just simply by precedents, what's gone on before. And there's conversations we haven't been having, we can fall into arrears. Maybe some of your work, in fact, over time, is that you will continue to bring to light various little niche neglects. It could be like that,
Could you imagine a format here where there's, for example, certain ingredients, of course, around story and ritual, but that there's even like open space for like very particular practical things to be spoken to, and maybe mentorship offered?
Yeah, I think mentorships, because we're beyond the time where it was desired, where a person just wants to be an elder in name and station or something like that, to where really for your own well-being you should be. Because you should be. This is the thing you should be giving now, because if it stays with you now, it'll make you sick.
Which stays with you?
Whatever that maybe the blessing that a mentor has to offer, maybe giving that material is what keeps them from getting sick.
Oh, I see.
Maybe there's this way in which hunger, how it works on the planet, and the need, the appetite, like you were talking about father hunger before, is that maybe fathers not giving of themselves the fathering made them sick in ways, mentally too. I think that the tangent, though, we've said so far doesn't support saying much more about that. We'd have to start from a different beginning to get to that. But I think maybe what you were really getting at is that there'd be room in a conference like this. And I'm not so sure there would be, because it's like a river. It flows along a certain kind of riverbed. But that doesn't mean within the work there wouldn't be, or within this community there wouldn't be. We've already begun some things. We do in the spring, for instance, a smaller conference. We do have our winter one, which has a large repeat of the people, but we're really gathered around the ritual and the literary stuff, but in the spring we do something where it's prose or it's poetry, and we alternate. And that one has brought us back to some of the old emotional charges that were there 40 years ago. The emotional wake up is really tremendous at those, and they're smaller and of a different kind. But we could, I think, have a forum for this very kind of things. Like, what is it that older men now know that they know younger men need to know, whether they know it or not? And then we also were thinking about doing something where in the summer we meet somewhere in Colorado, and it's purely about singing. Singing. Getting together, not just men either, but men and women, but the men from the men's communities, hopefully being very well represented, and from the Great Mother, the community there, but have at least an all Bly legacy kind of thing of getting together as a community in Colorado to sing for many days on end, sing, dance, and play instruments around the music.
That sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, turning then maybe to the final chapter of Mr. Bly, and I understand that you were around and supporting and present in some certain ways around that, for the listener as well.
Yeah.
Like my understanding is he departed from the conference in 2013.
That would be it. Yeah, that would have been his last time, I think.
Yeah, 2013. And then I understand he had oncoming dementia.
Yeah.
Or Alzheimer's. I'm not sure, but that's something that encroached and lived. And that was a significant chapter, right?
It was
almost 10
significant,
years.
and it was sweet. Robert, I remember sitting down with him in the garden asking him, well, how is it going with this? And he said, well, my word hoard is slowing down. Sort of like as if Robert could maybe put his finger up in the air and a bird would just come in and land on it, and that would be the word he needed for the poem he's working on. And so that was his first observation of how it was for him. And then I more and more often would, it began slightly before that, where my little infant daughter and my partner and I would go over and house it when they would be away, because I was almost family for Robert and Ruth, and so it would be like not a stranger doing that. And then it became that when Ruth needed to leave, I would come over and stay with Robert and cook him supper, and then somebody else might come in and cook breakfast and so on as I went off to work. But I would be there to make sure that he finally made it to bed and stuff, and then I would sleep in the guest room. But I did a lot of that taking care of Robert with Ruth, or if Robert would fall, I'd get the phone call to come and help if it wasn't like one for the police department the fire department. And I was there from 2014 and 2017 about living in the carriage house with my daughter right there. And that was a big transition for Robert from when he could go to the office and write some letters to when he was no longer interested in that at all anymore. And right around that time, he saw a video of himself on PBS with Bill Moyers, and he didn't realize it was him. And he looked at that and he turned to his wife and he said, I like that guy. so, Robert was he even did senility well, in a blessed way. He didn't panic. I don't remember him ever having, there was only one time, and it was when we were moving a gigantic medical bed, which he never used, into the living room so that it would be there. People think about things like it'll be there when needed. It was a nice looking bed. It wasn't an ugly hospital looking bed. It was like a sleigh bed, but it had inner workings to it. And Robert was going, Jonathan, get that out of here. Jonathan. And I kind of felt like I was kind of bucking the desire, because I knew Ruth needed to just have it, and it was a living room killer. It meant transformation of the house. Now the house is dedicated. Well, it ended up being that Ruth used that bed. Robert actually used one that we moved into the dining room when the days finally came for that. But he died brilliantly on the word Alleluia when I'm listening to music that was being played there. And then the last thing of the thing was this Alleluia, and Robert just breathed his last and he was off.
At home.
Mm-hmm.
Was it at home? Yeah.
At home. And now Ruth has the feeling that he's moving away swiftly, and I wonder about that. I wonder about what that means. We were at the grave, you and I felt this deep, good grief in my belly and in that sod that was there, freshly there, and just some sense of somehow the earth is agreeing to hold whatever all this was well. And how people depart or not, or how fast they go, I don't know how that all works out.
Yeah. What do you miss about Robert now?
I miss the friendship with the years, the being younger, having this friendship with an older presence, broader. I don't feel it as an absence, because I feel like I've broadened in the ways in which he was present, but there's more now. And what about that? And Robert's genius, absolute genius for naming a thing. Like I would shift from something I was working on, the 5 nerves of the male emotional body. I'd done that in graduate school, and I had just held on to the material. I felt like putting it into the library system there, it would only be found by the wrong person. Nobody who really needs to read it would, and somebody who shouldn't be reading it will. And then it'll be used to manipulate people or something. So I actually held back on it. But I shifted over to something with 3 because I wanted to understand elder energy. I had this idea that ideology is elder energy without elders. It's an effort to try to form and formulate that energy without absolutely any clue how to hold it in a human way, with a human life, in a human lifespan, on a human scale. And so I broke all the material down, and I told Robert, he always asked what I was working on. That's one of the things too, just somebody who asks you, what are you working on, or what are you reading, or what are you doing? That curiosity about you. And I just said, well, I'm working on the 3 bodies. Oh, spontaneity. Robert always knew how to translate what you were working on into its category, its categorical thing in the proper way. From as long as I'd known him, and I think with he himself, probably someplace in his 40s or 50s, that came where he just had like, there's a word for this, like a dispensation, where it's almost like a lot of intelligent water gets spilled on you, and now you can't help but be intelligent in those ways. And so on, you bear the stains of these remarkable intelligences. And having somebody who is alive, who is that, willing to do that. And then he would always come to me with whatever poems he'd been working on at that moment, even if I was in my tool belt working on the property, and hit me with like 3 or 4 or 5 of the poems that are going on. And something with like the onion fields, da-da-da-da, and I could hear that word oblivion. I could hear the poem behind the poem. And he knew that. And so he'd come right at me with what it was that he was working on. And I would come right back to him in a way where it's like, we are communicating in the essence of the poem he's working on toward manifesting it, towards getting it closer and closer and closer to just regular old, here it is, that poem could put its elbows on the table, lean in and look at you. And that's how immediate he liked to make the poems. And so being part of that process, and then he and Ruth and I would do that at lunches, whether it was prose or a speech that was coming up or something, interview with the magazine, where he was going over it to dial it in or whatever. Having that kind of a lunch is just, it's not going to McDonald's, you know what I mean? It's not reading a wrapper. It's not looking at a phone to see what might be of interest going on there, but really fresh, emergent content, and it's in human mind taking shape. It's a pretty cool thing to be around. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate immensely being able to experience, your stories and your time with Bly, and also the perspective on the conference and seeing many phases now, and especially of this moment marking the 40th anniversary.
Mm-hmm.
And is there anything, alas, I didn't ask, that you'd love to speak to before we close?
Well, a hope that you felt welcomed, as a man coming from your own journey where you have already taken on some of the cargo of that whole thing and, kind of made it part of meat that's on your own bones, but then come here and that you didn't feel, I hope, that somehow displaced by any of that work that you had done before, but that you came to a place where you really were in earnest welcomed. Because I feel like that's one of the things we're kind of hoping to extend, is really just simply that welcome, and around the world, because of recognition that Robert comes from here. And it would be nice for people who around the world who fall in love with the love that made him live, to have a place to come to get close to that, and to just kind of scratch and sniff for the pages of this magazine that we're folded into for a week even, and having that be a good thing and a blessing, and maybe some way that sustains something remarkable they're doing elsewhere, whether it's in Denmark or South Africa or in China or wherever somebody might be.
Yeah, thank you. I feel that I've already been moved by the particular way of coming together, right? And wrangling story and spontaneous poetry, and the quality of the relating among men feels significant to be around, especially men who've been in this work for this long, right? It matters to see men praise each other and love each other in this way.
On the level. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this conversation with Jonathan Stensland. Now, if you're a man and would love to experience the Minnesota Men's Conference for yourself, you're in luck, because the 41st edition is happening in early October in Minnesota, and you can check out all the details on their website, minnesotamensconference.com. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, share it with your friends, and post to social media. It really does help spread the word to get this out to the right folks. So thank you once again.